I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and today we're going to go for a drive in a car that I've really been looking forward to testing for a long time, the Kia Stinger. Occasionally in this line of work, there's just a car that falls through the cracks, and for whatever reason, you don't get to drive it when it was really popular. And that was a year ago when the Stinger dropped here in Australia as a kind of spiritual successor to the big front-engine, rear-wheel drive sports sedans that are really part of Australian motoring history. The Holden Commodore, the VF series that was Australian made, that ceased production almost a year ago to the week. The Ford Falcon ceased being built here a little before that, but the Stinger is a car in that vein because under the long bonnet of this rear drive liftback, there's actually a 3.3 litre twin turbo V6 engine with outputs not dissimilar to, say, the Holden Gen 3 V8 engine. So from a standing start, I think it looks pretty cool. It's certainly got the goods to go pretty quick, and it's got lots of space. A big car for a big country, if you like. But does this formula still really work in modern Australia? Is the Stinger a good facsimile of those sort of Australian sports sedans, or is it something different and perhaps even better? They're all the questions that I've been really looking forward to exploring with the Stinger, and we're going to check that out today. We're going to start in the cabin to see what life is like in this 60 grand GT model. The Stinger has a pretty cool cabin to look at with a real aviation-inspired theme in here that starts with a really broad dashboard and these gimbal-driven climate control vents here, which actually look and feel pretty cool to operate. You also get this really prominent center console that makes you feel ensconced in the Stinger's cabin like a cockpit. It's clearly a driver-forward car. There's an incline to the dashboard itself, big console, and the driving position is excellent. You can get properly low in the Stinger. There's heaps of adjustment in the seats. In this GT model, the driver gets 14 ways of power adjustment, and there's 12 ways of power adjustment in the passenger seat. Now, if you're buying a Stinger, I really reckon you should just go the whole hog and get the GT. This range actually starts quite expensively in the upper 40 grand range for a 2 litre with a cloth interior. Now, this 3.3 twin turbo V6 GT is only $64.90, so just make the jump. You'll be really pleased. Partially, that's because the GT gets easily the nicest interior of any Stinger. The seats are Napa leather. This particular car has the really fetching burgundy colour. I think that's way more appropriate than black leather for the Australian summer. Today is an unbelievably hot day already, and the seats just aren't hot. It's really good. One of the reasons they're not hot is also that they are very effectively cooled with ventilation. They're also heated for the winter months. That's exclusive to the GT. Also exclusive to the GT is this really nice flat bottom, chunky, perforated steering wheel that looks and feels really good. Now, the SI and the GT get an 8-inch screen, base model gets a 7-inch, but they've all got the same stuff. Navigation, Apple CarPlay, Android Auto, and DAB digital radio are all standard across the range. Other material quality is good, if not great. Lots of soft touch material up here and on the dash and on the doors. A little bit harsh and scratchy where your leg tends to rest. Not even on a long drive, because mine just sits there all the time. Now, you also get wireless charging, which is a nice to have. Storage is decent. 2 big cup holders between the seats, an enormous central bin, little phone tray here, another tray ahead of the gear shifter, and okay size, not great door bins. One of the really key parts of the appeal of a sporty family car is that you can actually carry people in the back, unlike a 2-seater or something really tiny like a BMW M140i. These seats back here are decent. There's also enough space to actually lean in and fit a child seat. The ISOFIX points, you can't even lose the cover. That's really smart. Close that door. Nice reassuring thunk. Quality is decent in the Kia Stinger. And you'll find that the room back here is really good as long as you're not too tall. For me, it's 6 foot. My leg room's really good sitting behind myself. Toe room's not so good though. That's because the driver's seat can get into a really low position. Now, if I sit back straight, my head is just about touching the roof, so anyone up to about 6 foot will be sweet. However, it is best to think of the Stinger as a 4-seater rather than a 5-seater, because this middle perch, you really do hit the roof, particularly given we've got the, not really panoramic, is it? Half-length sunroof in the GT. Does eat into headspace here. What I do like is that all Stingers have rear air vents as standard. That's a necessity in Australia. There's another 12-volt socket. Powered USB port back here, bringing the car's total to 2. Good, not great. What I do love is that you get the continuation of lots of nice soft touch materials back here. You don't feel too shortchanged having to ride in the back of a Kia Stinger. Unlike Australian sports sedans of old, the Kia Stinger joins the now imported Holden Commodore, or Insignia, whatever you want to call it, in being a large liftback. So instead of a sedan boot, you get a big hatchback, electrically operated in the Stinger GT, and you get an interesting space. It's really broad and long, but it's not very tall, and that's because that sloping roofline eats into the available room. It is a decent amount of room you get back there, not as big as an old Commodore sedan, but certainly decent. However, the Stinger's boot doesn't have any special features. There's no shopping bag hooks, there's no extra storage bins, not even releases for the back seats. Instead, you just get a big square space that you'll easily be able to fit a couple of suitcases into. So what's the Kia Stinger like to drive? Well, if what you're after is a pretty classic front engine, rear wheel drive, large sedan driving experience, then the big Kia actually won't disappoint. Just as this car sort of came along at the right time to be the spiritual successor to big rear wheel drive Australian made sedans, the Stinger does actually drive pretty similar to a lot of those cars. Perhaps not quite as refined and satisfying as a VF Commodore had become by the end, but for a first generation product, the Stinger is actually pretty convincing. Of course, the one that you'll want to go for if you're an enthusiast is the 3.3 litre twin turbo V6. That makes 272 kilowatts of power and 510 newton meters of torque. And for the train spotters among you, you'll see that those figures are actually quite similar to what Holden's 6-litre engine was making in the VF Series 1. Of course, the Series 2 stepped up to an LS3 with significantly bigger outputs again. And in fact, this twin-turbo V6, in many ways, it does resemble a V8 engine. Power delivery is different, but there's just so much strength there in the low and mid-range that it's a pretty effortless car to drive, with a caveat that I'll come to. There is another option that saves you $3,000 in the Stinger, and that's a 2-litre turbocharged 4-cylinder petrol that makes 181 kilowatts of power and 353 newton meters of torque. I'm going to be driving that soon, and I'll have more to say about the 2-litre Stinger, but my initial thoughts without driving that car is that, you know, you'd really want to go for the big donk in a car like this, with the Australian tradition of a large engine in a vehicle of this form factor. That said, the V6 obviously does add weight over the nose, about 80 kilograms more in fact over the front wheels, so naturally that has a small blunting effect on the front end of the Stinger. But that said, the handling of this car is actually very, very impressive. It starts with really good steering. The steering is quite light, it's quick, and it's very direct. The front end feels crisp and responsive. That was a real surprise for me. They've done that really nicely. And of course, the Stinger GT actually changed from initial OEM Continental tyres when it first launched a year ago. It now wears Michelin Pilot Sport 4 tyres. These don't break down as quickly as the Continentals under this car's 1780 kilo mass. Instead, these tyres feel really nice and grippy, especially once you've got a bit of heat into the front end. It just kills off understeer. But there is a big flaw in the handling of the Stinger, the handling and the dynamics combined, and that is the effect that the 8-speed torque converter automatic gearbox has on the whole handling and driving experience of this car. Put simply, the automatic just hasn't quite got that final layer of tuning polish on it. Instead, it chases high gears, even in the sport gearbox mode. You are never in the right gear in automatic coming out of a corner. You really have to drive the Stinger by the scruff of its neck in order to keep it in a low gear, keep it revving above about 4 grand, where all the meat, the best meat of that power and torque lies. Once you do get it in a low gear and you catch it in the right gear coming out of a corner, it's phenomenal. It's throttle steerable, you can kick the back out safely and securely. The ESC system has a lax but enjoyable tune. It becomes a really, really nice, easy car to drive on throttle. The issue is the automatic never wants to be in the right gear. Now, I hear you saying I can see the paddle shifters behind the steering wheel. That's true, there are paddle shifters, but they only work for about 10 seconds. After you've shifted gear and you leave it for a while, it just goes straight back to drive, and that's because the gear selector doesn't have a defined manual détente in it, so you can't force the car to stay in manual. This is a brilliant car. It's got a great engine, a really lusty engine. It's got good handling, good steering, and the ride quality in the GT is actually really good in comfort mode on adaptive dampers. The gearbox, though, needs to be addressed in the midlife facelift of the car. One other minor complaint would be that there's quite a bit of road noise. This is on a proper performance tyre, so I'm happy with that compromise, but especially on the concrete roads that are pretty common in New South Wales, in Australia, the Stinger is not what you would call a quiet car. Now, safety is actually pretty good. The range got an update in that all the cars in the range come with AEB after Kia had some problems with the base models, resulting in a 3-star NCAP crash testing rating because it didn't have AEB. They all have AEB now. They all have adaptive cruise control and forward collision warning, and they've all got driver fatigue detection. Step up to the SI, the mid-range, and nothing changes, but then step up again to the GT and they throw in blind spot monitoring and rear cross traffic alert. One thing the 2-litre Stinger will inevitably do better is that it will use a bit less fuel. The 3.3, look, it likes to drink, actually. Kia claim 15 litres per 100 Ks urban, that's about right. They claim 7.5 highway, and we did high 8s on the highway. Spirited backroad driving though, it was pretty easy to keep the economy under control, low 9s. So as long as you're not in stop-start traffic the whole time, the Stinger V6 won't be too bad on fuel, and it takes E10, bonus. So those are my impressions of the Kia Stinger. I'm glad this car exists. There are still people out there who want a large car that can seat 4 people with a strong engine and rear-wheel drive. Naturally, SUVs are important, but so are alternatives to the mainstream, and that's what the Stinger represents. I love the looks, the engine, and the handling once the gearbox stops holding it back. Definitely something for Kia to address in the midlife facelift. But really, complaints here are slim pickings. This is a largely affordable, cool car. I recommend it.